being here. We are recording the meeting, as you all just saw, and this series is a group effort from the United Way and the South Alabama Coalition of Nonprofits. So many of you are members of that, and I just want to thank you all for being here. Today we have Harold Dorton. He is a doctor of philosophy, I think.
Yeah, PhD in sociology.
Sociology and philosophy. He teaches at Spring Hill College. He is the husband of the wonderful Dorothy Dorton with AARP, who is with us today.
He's the better half.
And the fun father of two very active boys. So how we're going to do this, Harold is going to talk to us about DEI terms and some other things that he thinks would be helpful to our groups and how we move along as nonprofits to become as inclusive and bringing more diversity into not only our workplaces, but the people we serve, the people who volunteer for us, and the best way for us to reach everybody. And we think that the terms that are used, that some of us may not always be familiar with the true meanings of those terms. He is going to help us with that, and he is a wonderful expert at this. And like I said, we are going to finish with a poll about 1:45 noon, and then after that we'll be gone. So I'm going to let Harold talk for a little bit, and then we can ask questions throughout. Probably the best thing to do is share questions in the chat. And I'm just going to turn it over to Harold, and please share anything else that I don't know about you to the group.
Oh, no. You gave me a better introduction than I deserve, so I appreciate that. Also, well, what I can tell you is Catherine has shared a glossary of some really specific terms that's really helpful, and I have that document. If people want access to that, I'll be happy to share on her behalf. I'm going to use some terms, and unfortunately, the PowerPoint presentation I have, my technology is failing me. I wanted to use my PowerPoint as my background, and I am showing up as less than a hologram, and it just looks creepy. So I'm going to share my screen on and off and bounce back and forth. And so if anyone wants me to go back to any point on the PowerPoint, please do, and I'll do my best. So a year and a half in, and I still can't figure out Zoom completely. So forgive that. So again, thanks to United Way and the South Alabama Coalition of Nonprofits. I also want to say special welcome to some of the Project Thrive partners who I know are out there. So with that being said, I do want to start with saying we're here for diversity, equity, inclusion. I think that's a good place to start. I have people even in my world who said, I'm embarrassed, I should know what DEI is. Can we start there? Yes. So diversity, equity, inclusion. And I'm not going to start with the idea that these are positive things or we should value them. I'm guessing everyone here already sees some value in those things. If you're not clear, I'm happy to give you a hard sell later, but that's not my job. But again, I'm happy to do it. All right. So when we think of this, let me immediately awkwardly share my screen with you. And if I can, and I started in the wrong place. one of the things that we can get as the basic diversity is just representation of varied identities, but we want to think of this collectively and individually. You know, representation, it works at a group level. We have to have it at an individual level. When we think of equity, most simply, fair treatment and equality of opportunities, access to resources, and inclusion really refers to that culture of belonging. And we want to think about that as created by invitation and welcoming. So that's sort of where I think of the ideas at their most simple. And I would like for us to drill down just a little bit in the way I think about these. I think framing what we really mean by diversity, equity, and inclusion helps us really with anything else. So I would be sharing this, but if you bear with me talking, and I hate talking at you, I promise I'm going to ask for your participation. When we think about diversity, we're really talking about myriad experiences being represented in groups, organizations, and communities. So, what are those experiences that we really think should be represented? Don't make me treat you like my class and threaten your grades. What experiences do we value to say should be represented? Experiences based on.
I would say race,
There we go. Thank you, Mark. Stepping up.
gender. Yeah.
Mark already has an A.
I'm
right.
eager. I am sitting on the front row.
There we go. So yes, we know that race is one of the experiences, and we have to think of race as an experience, not a category, for sure. So let's think of both race and ethnicity as part of this that we should consider. What else do we want to consider as diversity and experience that we want to value? We want to have those represented.
Training and background or education.
There we go. Absolutely. We want to think about all kinds of background and those kind of experience, socioeconomics that are also represented. Very much with education. Good. All right, we're starting out well. Give me one more and you'll listen to me again.
What about an experience that's not just solely based on living in Alabama or solely based on living in the United States?
One of the things that we really need to consider are those social perspectives that include geographical perspectives. As someone who, after listening to Catherine and Dorothy's, they're way back in Mobile together as an outsider of 11 years in, absolutely, there's something that we think these are different ways of thinking. So we absolutely think of these social and political perspectives as part of the diversity we should include in our communities. And that certainly includes geography. So we traditionally think of them as Mark got us there first, race is a big one, the experience of race. And we want to think about ethnicity, language and language use, not just non-English language. We want to think about issues of national origin. We want to think about religious commitments, religious identities, religious affiliations. We really, especially during Pride Month, we should especially focus on some aspects of gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation. We're going to talk about those at length because I think some people have some real questions about those experiences. We also want to think about ability and disability. We want to talk about age and representing different ages and experience with aging. And we also want to consider one that we missed of veteran status, which I think is also pretty important. It's not as politically charged as it was in the post-Vietnam era, but we're seeing with over 20 years of endless war that the veteran experience is really, really misunderstood. So this is also one of the things we like to consider as part of diversity in experience. Let's go down a little bit further. When we think about equity, that uniform access to all opportunities, uniform access to resources. All right, that's the kind of easy part to put in mission statements. It's easy to put in on websites as these are the things we do. But equity also involves challenging bias and discrimination at both individual levels and structural levels. And we're going to talk about the differences in how those but part of equity is absolutely actively doing things organizationally and individually to challenge those things. And finally, I want to drill down again with inclusion just a little bit. We really have to think about differences in background and experiences being celebrated and welcome, not just tolerated or worse. And I hope we can see the difference there without me being preachy. And sorry, I'm now just seeing some of our diversity comments in the chat box. So I was ignoring those, but not intentionally. So I apologize for that. After talking about inclusion, I was excluding you. So that's my fault. But yes, we want to really think with inclusion. It's not just saying where these people are here. It's celebrating that difference in background being here. But getting past that, and I really want us to think in terms of identity, and allow me to share my screen just a little bit again. If I can, again, awkwardly do this, I apologize that this was supposed to be my background and that didn't work. So we want to think about identity as part of this. And identity is personal and social. And let me be a sociologist. This is how a person is located by self and others relative to others. And really, this is about seeing ourselves in particular ways. Much of our identity work is really presenting, showing things about ourselves, the way we see ourselves to others. But that also involves hiding some of those things that don't really match up with the way we think of ourselves. So another way to think about this is really identity answers that question, who am I? And that's a question we have to answer, but we also answer that question very much relative to others. And part of what we think about with diversity, and we've heard about in the news a great deal, is there's identity politics as part of this. There's who's allowed to express what. And all of these questions are really answered by identity. These are things that people think are important to how they understand themselves. And a big part of DEI is really respecting people's understanding of themselves and what really goes into how they understand who they are. And obviously that includes those experiences that we've talked about relative to diversity. And now, I won't ask you to do this in this because we are short of time, but I think it's really valuable at times to do a self-inventory of your own identities. How do you think about yourselves? It's a really interesting exercise that I'm not giving you homework or anything because I don't want to grade it, but it's very, very interesting to sit with a blank sheet of paper right on the top. I am with a blank and a period, and give yourself 20 blanks and fill that in. And think about how you present that to the world. What is deeply personal that you want to hold inside, and what is social that you think really, really defines who you are to others. And I think that's a really important thing to think about before we think about any of these other identities that I'm going to really sort of talk about, right, that matter as experiences of negotiating these identities. So if you're bored, you want to have a good party game and share, I'll say do that. It's really a useful exercise. You'll figure out some things about yourself that you don't always consider as well. So identity work, it gets into how it is personal, but there's very much a social aspect. So much of who we are, other people see, other people are trying to make sense of. And that's part of what we have to understand, that our understanding of who we are doesn't always match up to other people's understanding of who we are. How we understand our experiences don't always match up with how other people understand our experiences. And there, that disjuncture between how we see ourselves and how other people see us is is part of why we want diversity and experience, having those firsthand experiences with people who are different from us, who really give us new insight into our own understandings of the world, as part of what we should welcome, with especially diversity within our groups and communities. Right, but I do want to talk about some of these identities. Right, and since Mark started us off, sorry, I'm going to pick on that, Mark, but thank you again. We are going to talk about identities and experiences of race, ethnicity, and national origin, right, at first. And I want to talk about these really quickly, as sort of separate things, because I think we run into problems in conflating them sometimes. So I want us to think about race is based on categorization that's really based on physical characteristics that cluster together. I'm happy to give you this definition, but I do want us to get through this. The important thing here is we learn to cluster certain characteristics together. In American society, we often cluster race around things like skin color, texture of hair, shape of bridge of the nose, and mouth, but that's what we've learned to categorize. That's what we've learned to cluster together. Um, young children have to learn to distinguish by these racial characteristics, and that's true cross-culturally. So it could be possible to distinguish people, for instance, by eye color. If we said that was socially relevant, it clusters on our genome and is translated the same way. I won't make you do Punnett squares of that. But we could easily have, oh, that brown-eyed race, that blue-eyed race. Oh, those hazel people, can they make up their mind? Are they green or brown? Yeah. So when we think about this, it is learned. Right? We so often fall into this idea that race is a biological set of biological traits, but race is social. And the experience of race is also social. So how people start to understand you, the way they're classifying those categories, becomes pretty important. We distinguish that from ethnic background or ethnicity, which is identification with a cultural background or identification with a heritage. And it's really important to separate this out from race. They are often linked together, but we want to recognize that cultural heritage is distinct, but we also want to separate ethnicity out from national origin. These are sometimes related, right? But when we think of something being linked very specifically to a nation state instead of a broader cultural heritage, we're really seeing something else, right, going on. But we recognize that we conflate these, but I think it's important for us to really separate these out. Here's examples of what I'm talking about. There are some people who might identify primarily as Black, which is related to racial characteristics, but some people identify more readily as African American, which is a shared heritage distinct from race. And when we throw into that national heritage and immigrant status, then especially as part of this, we can see how we need to really clearly think about these as different experiences. I hate to use too many anecdotes, but I went to college with a Black man who was 7 feet tall, but he was also from Ghana and had never seen a basketball. But the amount of people who said, "Oh, so you're at college to play basketball," and then they heard his French accent and said, "Oh, you're not from around here." Um, his experience obviously was far, far different. One of the things, the lessons is that in that is let people do some of their own identity work. And let's not make some assumptions and say this is important to someone. And another area where when we think of how ethnicity and language heritage in particular can get complex in the way people want to do their own identification. Many people who identify with Spanish language background don't speak Spanish, but they will identify as Latinx or Latina or Latino. Some of them will identify racially as brown, but don't do that work for them. Many people who have some Mexican heritage will identify as Mexican. Some will identify as Chicano or Chicana. Some of them will distance themselves completely because they think it's disrespectful to be called Hispanic because that's more of a broad umbrella term. These are pieces of identity work that we need to let people do themselves. Again, this is how they think of themselves and their experiences. I don't want to have people learn from other people's mistakes, but I remember sitting with a friend of mine who identifies as Latina, but does not speak Spanish. And someone told her, who was white, "You can't be Latina, you don't speak Spanish." I hope I don't have to explain to you how that's problematic, but I think cases like this illustrate why we have to be careful in letting people do their own identity work with respect to race, ethnicity, and national origin. Some of the assumptions we make, if we're not coming to these with an open mind, right, we're putting people in boxes they don't put themselves in. And a big part of understanding, especially equity and inclusion, is recognizing that some people face people putting them in a box all the time. They don't have the privilege of pushing back against some of those boxes. And I think this is part of what we have to understand. Let me slow down. I'm so worried about getting through some stuff. Let me pause for some questions, if you have them. I know these issues of race, ethnicity, national origin, and immigration are big ones.
I I have a question.
Sure.
I love how you're talking about let people have their own identity. And I think we, especially as Southerners, want to, welcome people. Yet, like you said, we make a lot of assumptions.
There we go.
And what is the best way to, like if you're in a group and you're with new people, what's the best way, in your opinion, to foster that?
Yeah. I think the easiest thing, it's like with treat everything as all identity. If you can make a list of who you are, one of the things we know about people is lots of people like to talk about themselves. And sometimes you open up all the conversations by tell me about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And you figure out One of the interesting things you find out with respect to things like race, ethnicity, national origin, and immigration status, some people will tell you right away, this is really important for me to establish right away. And that comes up immediately. They don't want any confusion in your eyes about who they are. It's amazing how many doors we open up just by saying, tell me about yourself. You find out really quickly what's important, particularly when you ask some questions that's interesting.
Right.
And I think it's one of these really hard things because um, we don't want to reduce people only to this, some of the things that we can see about them. That could be the least interesting thing about them. And it could be only when you get to know them, you might understand some of the things about some of their experiences. They say, oh yeah, I forgot this might be relevant to you.
Yeah.
And I think, but opening that door by saying, I'm interested, is absolutely the easiest place to start. And coming from, see, I'm going to make some assumptions about your background, but that's because I know you a little bit. Yeah, being Southern and being white, sometimes people recognize that you're coding. I want to know about some of these experiences, but that's okay too. Be interested, but don't be pushy.
Mhm.
Yeah, and when they're ready, some people will be glad to talk about those things, but when the people aren't, they're not ready for it.
Right. Right.
And that's part, but just ask and ask in the most general terms. Mark, was that a question?
Affirmation.
Oh, thank you. I wasn't, yeah, okay, that was, but yes. All
I don't,
right.
we could do amen if you need for me to be
Okay,
more
no,
vocal.
no, no. I thought that was yes, I was making sure. Thank you. Yeah.
Does anyone
Any,
else have any questions?
yeah, please.
You know where we are now?
I can give very long answers to very short questions. Uh, Okay, well, and I'm also available for questions after. I had put my email in the chat box. Feel free to use that. I want us to also talk a little bit about gender. And again, I have this on my PowerPoint, and I can even send you the PowerPoint if you want that.
Great.
But when we think about gender, here's what I want us to think about as identity work. Gender is expressive, gender is performative. We express, we put it out there, we perform aspects of masculinity and femininity, but we also identify with aspects of masculinity and femininity. And that's very much different than the categorical aspects, the box checking that goes along with sex and sex category. Gender's a lot more complex. It involves a whole lot more than checking that box. How do we feel about ourselves? How are we expressing ourselves? It's a part of that identity work. And gender can be complicated because it's fluid. It varies from time to time, place to place. Even our learned expressions can change over time. It can change from culture to culture. There's not universal expressions of gender. The other part of this, I can again preach on this for a while, and we're going to talk more about this, but I want to be clear that performing masculinity and performing femininity, identifying with masculinity and identifying with femininity, they're not mutually exclusive. That categorical aspect of male and female, we often think as being categorical. Gender is not. I, let's talk about really quick about how this gets even more complex. There's gender identity, the things a person identifies with in terms of masculinity, femininity, androgyny. We also many times put people who will identify as non-binary or gender queer in this. Many people will identify that way when they have those identities. right? There's gendered expression, which is, again, that expression of those sort of identities. What are people putting out there in the world? So there's something going on between here and what we put out there in the world that puts gender identity and gender expression in relation to one another. All right, some of our identity work is really, really private, but the way we express it and put it out there is really an outward manifestation of what's going on up here. All right, so when we think about those expressions and respecting those expressions, it's part of really respecting the person and how they're seeing themselves. Right? And this gets hard because we do act as if there are things that are performed according to script. We know there are traditional gender roles. We know there are aspects of traditional masculinity and traditional femininity that we're quote unquote supposed to perform. And that's hard when that doesn't match how someone sees themselves. Right? But we know there's pressure for that. So all gender expression, all gender performance is really filtered through some of that social pressure that we have to understand. One of the things that's really good about having a welcoming environment is we put away some of the pressure that society can give us. Give people freedom to be how they see themselves, who they really think they are. And one of the things is you're always going to get the best of those people because they're being their authentic selves. This is good for them, but this is also good for you. You do not have to deal with so many barriers that people are so often forced to put up with respect to some of these expressions. Right? This is especially true when we think of sexual orientation and identification. And then again, we get into some of the more complex issues that come with LGBTQIA identities. And let me share my screen just a little bit here. And I apologize for doing this, and I'm not running through the PowerPoint. So forgive me for some of this. Yeah, when we think of people have seen LGBTQ plus, A plus, and many variations of that, this is being inclusive of some expressions that are related to some threatened forms of expression that are related to gender identity, gender expression, as well as sexual orientation, sexual identity. So this is dealing with thinking of yourself. This is dealing with expressing yourself. It's dealing with some of the complex aspects of attraction. What has been assigned to you and whether that fits or not. So all of these identities and the identity work that goes with it are really complex and complicated. All right, but I want to point out before I move on, this point I made at the end of the slide, we have to consider people who don't identify. And I put my own identifications up there. One of the things that we really need to do, particularly if you consider yourself an ally, don't think of those as default. And one of the most empowering things you do to someone when people talk about your own identities, when they ask you that, how are you doing, or tell me about you question, when you recognize that you say, hey, I identify as cisgender male, and I'm a middle-aged white dude, and that's part of how I think about myself as cisgendered, you realize how quickly you open up some doors to people who think of themselves as trans. And you're far more welcoming to share for them, sharing those aspects instead of subtly creating another. And these are the things we don't always think about, but it's part of the awareness, particularly if you think about yourself as an ally. recognizing that I identify as cis and straight, that's not default. Right? That's just part of who I am. That's not who everyone is. And me putting it out there when I'm announcing things about myself, it forms a more welcoming environment. And I think without getting into the complexities of every part of the LGBTQIA experience, opening those doors with the way you identify and the way you share things about yourself, it's not just being a good ally, it is also part of creating welcoming, that inclusion. Your experience is just as valid as mine. Right? That part of equity as well. Any questions on that? I know I'm unloading a lot on you, but we're running very short of time. And there are a few things I want to make sure I get to. I'm pushing on you. That's not to limit conversation.
Any questions? Don't be shy. This is the place to ask
This
it.
is the place to ask. This is judgment free, right? This one of the good things is we're here to educate. This is a place to learn. One of the things that I want to stress is don't ask people to teach you about an LGBTQ experience because they are. Say, so what? Tell me about being gay. I don't know anything about it. That's not their place. So why do you identify this way? That's not necessarily their place. This is the place for it. And again, I'm available. I had some stuff on prejudice and discrimination that I wanted to talk about, but I'm going to skip. If you recognize that prejudice exists up here, discrimination exists out there in the world, and discrimination is complicated. When I have some positions of privilege, which I do at work, I can actively discriminate individually. But that's easy to understand, and that's relatively rare and illegal. All right, subtler kinds of discrimination that exist in social structures are things we should pay more attention to and are part of why we have to consider diversity within organizations. I recognize in my work, for instance, and Mark, this isn't just for Leanne, but I will put out there, it's harder for a woman to get a PhD than it is for a man. It's harder for someone from an African-American community to get a PhD than it was for me growing up relatively privileged and white. If I don't recognize that experience and the subtle barriers that are in place, I'm not recognizing all parts of the experience, right? This is one of the things we have to pay attention to with discrimination. That pretense of colorblindness, for instance, is a failure also to recognize that discrimination exists. When I look at, say, a Latina colleague and I don't recognize the difference between her and I and the differences in opportunity, I don't understand her experience and I'm not trying to. For instance, when I see one of my African-American colleagues and don't recognize that their experience of negotiating an environment, a work environment that largely doesn't look like them, I'm not respecting their experience. So I want us to be really, really aware of that sort of myth of colorblindness and why that's an ideal. We're not paying attention to the subtle discrimination that a lot of people face every day. And so recognizing that without making it all about that is probably amongst the most important things we can do with respect to discrimination and fighting it really every day, is recognizing that some people are facing an uphill climb, and recognizing that uphill climb is probably one of the most welcoming things we can do. I do want to get in really quick to 3 definitions that let me get in. I know we're almost out of here, so I want us to be aware of tokenism, Tokenism is either using one person's experience to represent everyone's, or saying organizationally, we've made it because we have one person that checks this box. We are not a racist law firm. We have our one Black attorney. Yay, see, look at that, that African-American attorney. Let's point to him. Do you want to represent every experience for everyone? Yeah, that's the danger of tokenism. This is related to essentialism, the idea that any one feature, characteristic or identity defines a person. We do some subtle discrimination when we put this out there. When we refer to someone as, you're talking about going out to the bar and having a couple of drinks with your friends, and you talk about your friends, and then you immediately say, yes, and then my one gay friend. Oh, wait, what does that have to do with anything? We were talking about drinking beer. Oh, wait, that's always a part of who they are to you? Ooh, oh. This is where we have to be really careful. You know, there's some essentialism that shows up in representation that gets a lot of news. For baseball fans, part of why the Cleveland Indians dropped their representation was because of essentialism. Native Americans shouldn't be depicted as solely bright red with large noses and saying that's who they are, especially from a privileged group. That's the easy essentialism to understand. The subtler kinds of essentialism, those are microaggressions. Those are things that people in some less than privileged groups face every day. And even when we're being well-meaning by sort of virtue signaling, look how diverse my group was because we had our gay friend out for drinks. You're making that about you. And the worst thing you can do with inclusion is making someone's identity about you. And if I could caution you against anything, that's the biggest thing. Don't expect people to teach you. That's about you, not about them. If they volunteer to teach, keep those doors open. Absolutely. Have the relationship with someone where you can say, hey, you're my friend. If you're comfortable, I want to understand this, but it's not your job to educate me. I'm going to Google some of this stuff. But if you're willing to sit down and talk to me at some point when you're ready, I want to learn and I'm buying. And also respect them saying, nope, I've taught enough people. Sorry, not my job. Thanks for being well-meaning, but that's not my job. I got my own burdens to carry around. Adding another burden is a subtle form of well-meaning aggression. And this is where it shows up subtly when we're trying to be our most welcoming and we think we're inviting that in. Let's be careful with that. When someone opens the door, walk through it, but don't bang that door open because you're used to banging those doors open. I think that's the biggest thing I can caution you against. Let me share one thing because we're out of time. I'm 1 minute over and I don't want to be that guy. A guy named Robert Sellers, who does DEI at the University of Michigan, which is one of the largest and most prestigious institutions of higher education in the United States, makes it the most simple. Diversity means everyone's invited to the party. Equity means everyone can contribute to the playlist, and inclusion means everyone has the opportunity to dance. I wish I could say that and take credit for it, but I'm going to give credit to Robert Sellers for saying that better than I could. But if you want to give me credit for that, please do. And I think it's an easy way for us to understand all of these things. But what I hope as value added is thinking about these terms in identity and that reflection of the personal, putting it out there and how difficult that can be.
Well, thank you so much, Harold. I feel like I could sit here for the rest of the day and listen to you. I mean, this was fantastic. You know, I know it was short, but it really opened up a lot of thought for me. I'm going to get on my computer after my next event. And, I think we would all agree we'd love to have you back in some
Yeah.
form,
Okay, yeah,
just
absolutely.
to
I'd be happy
learn
to do it.
more and ask questions from your experiences. And we really appreciate it.
Absolutely, no, I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to do that. So, and again, my email is in the chat box. I'm a little slow because it's summer and sometimes I'm slower in the summer, but I do promise I will get back to you. I'm happy to share the PowerPoint I was going to share. I'm happy to share the glossary of terms that was very much thankfully provided by Catherine and United Way.
Well, thank you. And we
Right.
will share all that with everybody. And if you all will hang on for a minute, we have a poll for today. So if you'll take a few minutes, and then I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye to everybody after you finish the poll. Please complete it. And thank you again for joining us, everyone. Thank you, Harold. And when we have the recording, we will put it up, and I think they are available on, help
You
me,
have a YouTube link.
YouTube.
Okay.
You have
Yeah.
time for
I-
questions?
Yes, Monica.
Okay, I had my hand up, but I didn't want to interrupt.
Oh,
Um, Harold, would you say, do you know as far as with the best practices in helping with diversity, equity, and inclusion, as far as moving the needle? So many times we have opportunities, trainings like this, we host things or whatnot, but the needle is not moving as far as diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially in the workplace, with our board representation and leadership and whatnot. What would you say would be the best practices as far as improving diversity, equity, and inclusion?
well, of course, education like this helps. And I think when all people who are part of an organization get this and not just as a kind of pro forma thing, part of what we know is when people make this as part of their scheduled workday, that very much helps when people are asked to do it voluntarily. The people who are invested do that. So making it required without making it a requirement is one of the best ways it happens. One of the things we also know that creating a culture of diversity can happen, and equity and inclusion can start at the ground roots level, but it has to be reinforced at the top, if not started at the top. And it has to look right, because one of the things we know is people smell BS, and it's hard to say we're committed to diversity when you look at an all-white organization, for instance. Oh, boy, that's a great commitment you have there. Put your money where your mouth is. And some of those changes, obviously there are legal issues that we could talk about with that, but there does have to be buy-in at all levels of the organization. And that starts with recognizing the importance of it and recognizing the value, not just for individuals, but for the organization as well. And that's what I can't emphasize enough. You have better participants, better employees with a more welcoming environment, with a more diverse environment. You get better employees. And I think it takes some buy-in at that level. Realistically, let me add, sorry, I give long answers to short questions. Culturally, we're in this place that there's some resistance to this simply because quote unquote woke culture is bullshit, and I don't want to buy into that. And I think this is really hard, that social justice and being woke is now pejorative in some circles, rather than being a value we would all want to sort of have. And I think there's an uphill swim because of that, because in some communities, recognizing the value of this, you're starting with a barrier that some people aren't willing to drop. And I think that's a different conversation and a different thing to sort of address. But if you want to email me, I have some other thoughts.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and maybe that's something we can have another session on.
Yeah.
So that's, I know, because we feel the same way.
Yeah.
It's hard. How do we move the needle?
Yeah.
So, thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.
Erica, I believe, is going to put up the poll. And again, I am so sorry that we have to leave this
Yeah.
great conversation. And
And
thank you again, Harold.
Thank you for asking. I'll see
Yeah.
some of you soon.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Harold.
Bye.
All right. I think we have a poll.
Hey, Catherine,
It already went up.
was the chat was disabled. Someone walked in my office. Did that happen while someone?
Ooh. I don't know about that.
Oh, okay.
I hope
Yeah,
I didn't
at about
disable
15
it.
minutes after the hour, the chat was disabled, and so that's why he wasn't getting the responses he was looking for.
It is?
That's what it says for
Y'all
me.
see the
Mine
poll?
is too. It just
Both
says
of mine
disabled
is.
at the bottom
Yeah.
when you open up chat.
Uh-oh. It
I
may
thought it
be
was just
something
me.
on our end.
Yeah, I just
Stop
wanted to let
recording.
you know as you get ready for your next meeting in case you need to figure out how to read
Okay,
it.
we were having some issues before we started this. I don't know if it has anything to do with that, but I apologize. We will try to get this out to everyone. Thank you for pointing that out, Dan, because yes, I don't see it. And Erica said the poll is up.
Yeah, no
So,
problem. Harold did a beautiful job. It was a great training.
yeah.
Yeah, we could do even more. Thank you.
All right. Well,
Agreed.
thank
I think
you
we
so
can
much,
stop
everybody.
recording.
I apologize for the technical issues.
No
It's
problem.
all good. Thank y'all for
Bye-bye.
organizing.
Okay.